Welcome to the Artisan Podcast, where we share insights from some of the world's leading minds. Today, we have Ian MacFarlane, one of the most brilliant and creative people I've ever encountered. We actually co-launched the hugely successful global asset allocation service at the Bank Credit Analyst. Ian is now one of the leading executive coaches in North America, and he's here today to share insights on the future of work. Enjoy. So Ian, my wife works at Airbnb. They recently announced a policy that allows any employee to work anywhere in their country. For example, a US employee can work from home as much as they like and in any city that they like in the US. Is this the future of work?
I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's an old cliche which said that the pandemic accelerated trends which were already evident, and certainly the advance of technology and the ability to work remotely was already in place. What was missing is the willingness to actually make that transition. And in the end, it was the pandemic which took over from that human willingness and put it in place anyway. The issues here are not just about where you're working, but how you're managed and how you set yourself up and how you contract with your employee, with your employer rather. And I think there are a number of things to bear in mind here. It's difficult enough to manage a herd of cats, as you know, working in the financial services industry for so long. Put those cats in their own home and try to manage them, and that problem is multiplied many times over. So we could talk ad nauseum about all the different aspects of how the future of work will unfold, but there's one thing above all else which will predominate: the need for more effective leadership. And I make the distinction between leadership, which is about getting people to do things because they want to do them, that intrinsic motivation, and management, which is about getting the people to do things in the most efficient way possible, but really kind of at the end of the day, relying on extrinsic motivation, what you're paid, your bonus, etc. Survey after survey says the world is changing. And this is more than just the sort of old adage which was trotted out by Carl Jung. So it says we spend the first half of our lives being ambitious and the second half of our lives being looking for meaning. We're now looking for meaning from day one, which reflects the type of society which we're living in.
So what would be the advice that you give, leaders in this world where, maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, people were looking to make a buck and now, they require meaning. But over and above that, if we look at the last 30 or 40 years, there just hasn't been the hardship that we saw, among our parents' generation that lived through the Depression, that lived through World War II, that lived through the Cold War, like really tough times. So when something came up, they really had the resiliency to deal with it. Whereas if we look most recently, even the recessions, with the exception of 2007, 2008, were quite shallow, and policymakers just immediately flooded the economy with liquidity and fiscal spending. So there just wasn't as much pain. So what kind of advice do you give managers where workers are both demanding meaning, but also it's very difficult to criticize and it's very difficult to guide? So what is the advice you provide in this environment?
Well, I think it's the onus is on all of us to advance our leadership skills and advance our management skills. So I'm a great one in thinking about systems and complex adaptive systems, which is the basis of evolution. They evolve through being tested. And when they are tested, they're up to the task. And very often what you find is people hold a certain point of view, and then for a long period of time, then very suddenly that changes. And the system has to adapt to that new reality. And what is clear now is, and most of my clients are situated in the technology sector, the pace of change is much more rapid than most human beings can encounter. Can manage with rather. And what that in turn means is you have to have some anchor. What's the anchor around which you determine your day-to-day actions and how that fits in with the bigger picture. So leadership is about articulating a clear vision. Leadership is about listening. Leadership is about having a clear idea of the way you're perceived in an organization. And leadership is about understanding how you can make the system work for you to get what you need done. And that requires a much larger set of skills than being a bureaucrat or following a set of rules. It requires creativity, it requires adaptability. I think it was MacArthur who sort of said, rules are made for the obedience of fools and are meant to be broken anyway. I wouldn't go that far, but rules are no more than a guideline. And cognitive agility, adapting to what the US military back in the late 1980s called the VUCA world, a world which was volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, has to come to the fore. And that means that kind of amidst all of that, what is your vision and how do you articulate that vision? How do you get that buy-in from people? And it's not like a command and control structure. It's more like the skills of persuasion, the skills of getting people's intrinsic motivation going, getting them to do the jobs because they want to do them. And the trick about intrinsic motivation, the literature is very well summarized by Daniel Pink, is threefold. One is to actually give people independence. So you may need to determine the what and the why, but the how rests in their hands. So micromanagement has always been a bad thing. Micromanagement in the current environment is an absolute catastrophe. The second element of that intrinsic motivation, which stems from that first point, is giving people the ability to perfect their art or their métier or their skill set. And that's really about education, but that's also about trial and error. And that trial and error only works in an environment where there is psychological safety. And that psychological safety means you can speak up, you can give your point of view. And if you do fail, you move on. So back in the 1960s, we coined this phrase for the kind of motivation or goal setting, and we use the acronym SMART: specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and timely. And we thought that, yeah, maybe if you achieved that 100% of the time, that was a good thing. We now know, no. It's important to set goals which are challenging enough so you fail now and again. And it's through that reflection on failure that advance occurs. And so organizations which encourage people to try things and don't necessarily punish them for not succeeding are the ones which tend to be at the cutting edge. And I would almost argue that the old sort of game of setting goals which are kind of easy to meet and therefore you manage the expectation of your leadership, that's not very conducive to surviving in the modern world.
Mm. And so if we bring it, kind of home, so to speak, this work from home trend, is it going to continue? Is it going to reverse? Are we going to kind of the normal business will adapt what was previously in technology, where you work from home 2 to 3 days a week and go into the office the other days? Where do you see, the trends over the next, 2, 3, 5 years?
Well, the secular trend is definitely towards, if not completely working from home, at least a hybrid model. The cyclical trend, as the labour market begins to tighten, and that's already evident, for example, in the technology sector, might be that employers demand more of their employees to be live. But underlying all of that is the fact that the underlying trend is definitely towards remote working. And what the pandemic did is it highlighted the negative aspects of close living within societies, as well as the advantages. So it's now more balanced. Um, so, and I think the other way of thinking about this as well is we were all talking about the end of globalization, or at least globalization reached its peak prior to the pandemic. I think what remote working has done is it's actually pulled that into question. And now the issue is, well, if people want to work remotely from wherever they want to work, how do policymakers impose restrictions on their ability to do that? Where does that tax liability fall? Um, and at the end of the day, the new normal is what people adapt to. And once there's a new normal, it's very difficult to change back. So I think the die is already cast in terms of that remote working. And that has a myriad of implications right the way across psychology, economics, and politics. If you think back at what's caused the world which we're in, it was a combination of three things. One is technology, and the ability of technology to replace a lot of jobs, but more to the point to enable people to work remotely. The second element of that is a geopolitical one, is a lack of leadership, and there's this feeling of almost a lack of control, of the ability to sort of for policymakers to get behind what was going on and try and get on the front foot and change that in some way. And the third element of that is that some of the societal trends which were put in place by the post-war baby boomers and were continued by Generation Y, it's actually changing to the extent that, if you can't afford your own home because housing has become unaffordable, and if you are faced with these existential issues like climate control, or global warming rather, and you're faced with these existential issues of how do I find meaning amidst all this chaos? I mean, this change. I mean, people are not going to be working for the same company for 20 years going forward. We've already seen the demise of the defined benefit salary schemes and the move to the defined contribution and the uncertainty that brings, and the onus it places on people to be actively responsible for their future as opposed to take a passive role and allow somebody else to do it for them. All of these things are still very much in play. But I think the one thing above all else which is in play is that it took 2 millennia for us to evolve to where we are today in terms of our personal interaction. Our reality as human beings is created in a relative sense. The theory of mind is about how we interact with other people. So it used to say, for example, the boss used to say, for example, don't talk about your salary to everybody else. And they were actually trying, and that was a professional thing to do, but they were actually trying to defy human nature, which is always to relate your own position to everybody else's position. And as you move towards this kind of remote working model and not being in the presence of other people, we don't know what long-term implications that's going to have. For example, there are certain critical periods in the evolution of the human brain. So students and kids who are being educated afar, we don't know what the long-term implications of those kids are going to be. Just one way. Secondly, when we're talking now, and we're talking live, you're receiving my message a little bit after I deliver it, and that's deliberate. That was set up for security reasons, but subconsciously the brain is having to adapt to that. I can't see your body language beneath your chest, for example, and that's difficult as well. And if you've ever tried to do a presentation where you've had loads of people in front of you on Zoom, you have to constantly try and bring them into the conversation. And we simply don't understand yet enough of how that's going to impact the nature of leadership, the nature of motivation, and how our kids evolve going forward.
Well, I'm gonna push you a little bit on those three implications: the economic, the technological, and the social, and begin with the social, because it seems like the work from home and the general trend in the workplace is an acceleration of the atomization that is a real characteristic of modernity, and this is a substantial acceleration. And the argument among preeminent sociologists for quite some time is that this leads to an anomie, a loneliness, kind of makes sense, but that's really tied to, physical characteristics like suicide. And we're currently seeing just an epidemic in terms of anxiety and depression. And do you think that part of that is related to this acceleration in the atomization of society? Because as you correctly said, we're not built for this. And then the second point, so really to speak to that social impact, and then the second point is, what does a manager do about this epidemic of anxiety and depression, which is of course affecting their workers?
I forget which eminent person said, youth is easily deceived, but is quick to hope, because it's quick to hope. But what I see in my coaching practice, for example, a lot of young people talking about they don't want to bring kids into this world. They don't want to get married. They don't want to have kids because they don't want to actually subject them to the way they see the world evolving, particularly in terms of the climate issue, but more in terms of inequality, more in terms of that loss of meaning. And we see that in the data in the US, for example, even prior to the pandemic, a certain part of the US population, i.e. people, white, blue collar workers, their life expectancy was falling for the first time in the post-war period. And I don't think that's unrelated, and some of the studies have demonstrated that, to that lack of purpose. So it is, what is your anchor through all this rapid change? What do you look for? And that sense of purpose is very important. Coming back to that statement about Carl Jung made earlier on, it's essentially about trying to find that meaning. What's your anchor through all of this? And there are two elements to the anchor. What are your values? What's important to you? How are your day-to-day activities actually contributing to meeting those values and taking a regular check-in on those? But beyond your values can change, right? What's important to you at 20 is not necessarily important to you at 35 or 40. You'll know that well in terms of being a late father. But the issue here is beyond your values is your purpose, and that purpose remains reasonably constant over time. So for organizations which had that mission statement up on the wall, which nobody ignored, everybody ignored and nobody really focused in on as they were walking in every day, that's very important. But beyond the mission statement, it's more like, okay, this is what we do, but more importantly, this is why we do it. And it's beyond those bottom line earnings. There is a bigger thing at stake. And that's coming back to that picture of that intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation.
So then maybe on to the economic implications of this trend, because, right now we're just seeing this incredibly tight labor supply. If we speak to our clients or some of the firms that we manage, it just seems impossible to get workers, impossible to hold workers. It's just very, very difficult. We also see that in the macro data and in the wage growth. Yet you're saying intermediate term, the work from home and the work from anywhere massively increases the effective labor supply, maybe even beyond a country's borders, so beyond what Airbnb has put in place. To be honest, Airbnb also allows employees to work anywhere in the world for a 3-month period. And the only reason why it's not longer is because it's very difficult to do the taxation from an administrative point of view. Otherwise, it'd be like, yeah, work from anywhere you like. So, in the near term, very tight labor supply leading to massive wage growth. Intermediate term, it sounds like it's a big increase in supply, which would be negative for labor versus companies and good for corporate profits. How do you see this panning out in the short term and in the intermediate term?
Well, I think in the short term, some of the data is reflection of what's happening. And remember, the labor market is a lagging business cycle indicator. And we're already seeing, for example, we're moving away from a supplier's market, i.e. people who are in the labor force, to a buyer's market in the technology sector. And that technology sector was a lead indicator among the sectors, and in turn that labor is a lagging indicator. What I would expect to happen over the coming months is for those trends which we've seen in the technology sector to become manifest in other sectors as well. In other words, that the balance of power switches back to the employer versus the employee. But that is the cyclical dimension of this. Because let's face it, what that's actually happened here is we had inappropriately easy policy at a very late stage of the business cycle. We had a supply shock, and the combination of the two created that perfect storm, which led to that inflationary surge. If you have been brave enough to change your job, you have kept ahead of inflation. If you've remained employed with your existing employer, the majority of people have had a real wage decrease. And practically, in terms of that shock which has occurred, there's been adverse terms of trade in the developed world, and that adverse terms of trade should be reflected in us becoming poorer, i.e. people who are participating in the labour force. And you can respond to that in one of two ways. You can respond to that in the way the Japanese did in the 1970s by easing monetary policy to actually offset that terms of trade shock. Or you could act the way the Germans did, which was tightening monetary policy to lean into that terms of trade shock. And what is happening right now is central banks are following the German model from the 1970s and leaning into that to actually constrain the impact and make it more difficult for labour to actually barter to the extent that they retain their real living standards. I think that's been exacerbated by the fact that the breakdown of unionisation and globalisation and these longer-term trends which we were talking about earlier on are also making it very difficult for people. So bottom line here, I think short-term, maybe Labour is actually disadvantaged from a cyclical perspective. Long-term, I think it benefits. It benefits everybody. And I think that kind of the sole entrepreneur operating behind the company model is the way to go. And that both parties will have the chance to sort of break and reconnect, but individuals will be working multiple. So kind of what I'm hearing a lot about, well, can you have a side hustle? I think the side hustle becomes the normality. And that creates a new reality in the workplace.
What about the third, technology? We're just kind of in the early innings of AI. I mean, right now it's not even true AI, it's machine learning, but eventually there will be true self-learning machines. So, how do you think that plays out long-term in terms of the workplace, in terms of the power of labor, and especially in terms of the lower 50% of the labor force and the less skilled workers. So how do you see that playing out, the technology trend?
Well, the implications have already been apparent now for a couple of decades, or perhaps even longer. If you look at the Consumer Price Index in the United States and have a look at the education component, for example, it's substantially outstripped everything. So there's been a premium placed on knowledge and knowledge acquisition. And therefore, that is why the bottom half of the 50% in the United States, for example, haven't had really an improvement in their living standards going back that couple of decades. To some extent, it was braked in the late 1990s by the subprime mortgage and the Clinton administration, who basically sort of said, okay, we're going to need people to have access to their own homes, which their parents didn't have. But by and large, their living standards have deteriorated. And that tension is not going to go away in a hurry. And what it's going to mean is that we're going to have to democratize access to education. We are going to have to understand that education is a right if you're going to survive in the world in which we live. And the costs of earning an education at a fancy school, sure, people of minimal means can still get in if they get a college scholarship. Maybe they're the top 1 or 2%. But what happens to the comparison between the 90th percentile of people from working class backgrounds and the 90th percentile people from middle to upper middle class backgrounds? Clearly the latter are majorly disadvantaged. And that tension won't actually be able to survive unless we find ways of dealing with it. The second aspect of this is the shelf life of knowledge, which is becoming shorter and shorter and shorter the whole time. So almost what you do in your degree is out of date 5 years later. So how do you compensate for that in terms of offering continued educational opportunities to people? And I think the third element of this is the education about who we are as individuals, that self-awareness. Because amidst all this uncertainty, you have to have a good self-awareness to be able to survive. It's almost synonymous with resilience. And that resilience of continually having things changing. You know, what's the definition of tactics, right? A lot of people would say that strategy today is what the tactics were 10 years ago. Because you try something, it doesn't work, you change the strategy, and we're not actually built as human beings to cope with that. Hence the kind of things you were talking about in terms of the mental health crisis which are going on. And the data there is quite shocking. I mean, it says that 1 in 4 of us will suffer some sort of mental health problem every year. And if you look at the amount of money which is actually spent within healthcare systems towards, and particularly in public systems for healthcare, it's nowhere nearly enough. So that's the other aspect which we're going to have to look at. And brain science and understanding the interaction between genetics and understanding the interaction between genetics and psychology, all of these things are going to come to the forefront and become even more apparent. I hope we live to the day when they sort of say, somebody is proud to sort of say, oh, I'm seeing a therapist, because that will show their vulnerability, will show that they're living in the real world, and will show that they want to adapt to the new realities which are going on.
At least 1 in 4 of us.
At least 1 in 4 every year.
Yeah.
Every year. And right now, the access to that medical care is just not there for a lot of people. For example, in the province of Quebec, $100 million was given to the health system to improve access to mental health care. Nobody seems to know where that money's gone. And it seems like and worldwide, you want access to some sort of mental health care. On average, you can be waiting 1 to 2 years to get that. Yeah. And that's not acceptable.
Way too.
And there's an economic consequence to that in terms of productivity.
Yeah, I mean, just, coming back home, in terms of some of the things that you'd mentioned earlier, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't, speak to some of the trends in the pandemic. And some of those could very well, reverse in the future, and some of them accelerate. So, at least the stuff that will have investment implications, where people live, how they work, real estate, that sort of thing. What do you see as the trends that will continue? That 5 years from now, there'll be a higher percentage of the population than now?
Well, what we saw through the pandemic was that the purchase of goods obviously trumped the service sector. As we move towards a hybrid working model where we don't have to isolate, I think that desire for good purchases will fall away, and that the services sector. So if I was to bet where the next inflationary burst will be, it would be more in the services sector rather than the goods sector. It's very difficult to imagine that technology, for example, will be able to give you a haircut. You never know, but it's unlikely anytime soon. Healthcare in particular is interesting because healthcare beyond remote contact with family doctors, that was not able to operate efficiently through the pandemic. So what could happen in that sector to bring that into the reality that we're going remote? I think the other things to bear in mind are our leisure time. Not only are we going to be working remotely, but in all probability, we're going to be working for 4 days a week, right? So the leisure time, the leisure industries are likely to benefit even more than they have been going forward.
If we look at, and I guess from your argument, it would be from several millennia, but definitely pre-pandemic, work was so important, not just for us to get meaning out of life, but also just all of the social institutions that really form the fabric of society. It's where most people, met their wife or the friends that they retain, into their 40s, and just like so many important things as you're making that transition from childhood to adulthood. And so what happens to those institutions and to society, if these trends towards work from home and less ties to corporate culture, what happens if they continue, which I guess is the expectation?
Well, I had one word echoing through your question, that was discipline. Work gives you that discipline. You go into work, you have to work certain hours, you have to behave in a certain way. And if you're doing that from home, some of that discipline breaks down, right? But I think it comes back to what we talked about earlier on, and that makes leadership much more difficult. I mean, how do you motivate people in that type of environment? It's already difficult enough. We hear about kind of, oh, young people don't really want to work. They don't understand the difficulties, which our generation had to go through. But what about the difficulties they're facing? The difficulties of all the uncertainty, which is about the fact that it's very difficult to get a job. When you and I went to the workforce, probably we put a suit and tie on. We did about 5 interviews. We walked away with 3 job offers. Today, people may have to deliver 1,000 CVs to get a couple of interviews. So we shouldn't forget that, how much more difficult life has become, particularly working life, from their aspect. But if your contract with your employer gets shorter and shorter term, for example, what does that do to your ability to actually take on a mortgage or to buy that car? How do you psychologically react to that uncertainty which has been brought to the fore? How do you keep up with all the new trends and technology which are going on? As we get older, our verbal ability improves, but our mathematical ability, for example, our mental arithmetic begins to decline. So does that mean we'll be on the rubbish tip at 30 or 35 rather than at 50 or 55? These are all questions which have not yet been answered, and we don't know what's going to happen. My bet is that we are going to go to a higher savings ratio going forward, given all this uncertainty, given the shorter-term nature of people's contractual obligations and fiduciary duties with companies. And we are therefore going to be in an environment which is going to accentuate what we saw before, which is a lack of consumption going on. Right? So the consumption was reliant on consumption in the developed world, and we were all kind of really sort of frustrated about the lack of consumption in the developing world. I think maybe we go into a lack of consumption type of model in the developed world. Now, ultimately, that is social suicide, right? Because people used to talk about the paradox of thrift. You're scared of using your job, so you cut back on your spending, which justifies your fears because that reduces aggregate demand and that creates unemployment. And the same thing is happening in terms of companies managing the bottom line rather than the top line, and in terms of them reducing demand potentially there. But more to the point, these societal trends point to, I think, a more of a disinflationary environment than an inflationary environment. And what we've seen is a jump in inflation in an essentially disinflationary environment. So the question is, what does a labor market look like in a disinflationary environment?
I mean, you'd assume that labor must be weak. It has to be weak because labor is 62% of corporate expenses. So definitionally, it has to be weak. It's too big.
Yeah.
Well, that definitely gives our viewers a lot to chew on. Maybe if we make some of the investment implications a little bit more specific. Our clients have a big chunk of their assets in real estate, particularly multi-residential, because it's relatively safe. It has tax advantaged income. The rent growth is going through the moon, so it's actually been an excellent inflation hedge and has been historically as well. So that's multi-res. But where do you see these trends in the workplace affecting the office market, office real estate?
Well, I think the office market real estate really sort of follows what's been happening in terms of the retail real estate market, where the retail real estate market has been hit by the fact that people are buying more and more stuff online. And if people are working remotely, there's going to be a demand for smaller units. There's going to be a demand for kind of hot desking. And in the short term, obviously, the health issues of hot desking have prevented that from happening more. But as that fear drops away, I think you'll see more hot desking and smaller. If the demand in terms of number of transactions doesn't fall away, the demand in terms of the space requirements, I think, will definitely fall away, and that obviously has implications. The multi kind of residential market is also an interesting one. I remember you and I having these conversations over a decade ago about the ridiculousness of apartment prices in Montreal, and having been lectured by some of our ex-colleagues about how this is stupid. And 10 years later, that would be one of the best investments you could have made in Montreal. But if you're going to get this ongoing trend towards people working remotely, I think in some of the smaller cities, that doesn't impact adversely the kind of rental market for offices. But in some of the larger cities where it's difficult to communicate in, that definitely is going to have an impact. And if gas and energy prices remain at the elevated levels they are now, that's going to have a further adverse effect.
Yeah, I mean, my view for quite some time is that office is broken, basically, well, since April 2020. And the thing is that office is extremely leveraged with debt, because before the pandemic, everyone said, "Oh, these are 10-year leases. It's extremely safe, so I can load up on debt." And the only way the equity holder could make any money is by massively over leveraging. So there's a ton of debt, and the debt has to be paid no matter what. But you're going to have structural weakness in revenue, structural weakness in rents, structural weakness in net operating income, the same as you had in retail for the past 15 years. It's a very slow burning fuse, right? Because again, you have 10-year leases. It's going to take another 8 years to fully flush this out. But by year 4, you'll probably see most of it come out, because people will sublease, and there's going to be a massive wave of defaults. I mean, there's no doubt about it, and that is in front of us. In terms of multi-residential, our managers are really focused on small to medium-sized, fast-growing markets in the south of the U.S., where everybody is moving to, and really like no exposure in a place like New York, where you have these extremely high cap rates. And intermediate term, I'm not sure that you'll get the migration growth or the sort of income growth that you'll get in these other markets. And maybe one last thing on on the impact of COVID, there's maybe 1 or 2% of the population, at least in the U.S., has long-term COVID, and so they're effectively out of the labor force for at least some time. And then over and above that, you have some people that are fearful, because they're older or maybe they're immuno deficient. And so how do you see that impacting, the labor market overall? Is that one of the reasons why we're seeing this fast wage growth? Is that just going to ameliorate in the future? What are your thoughts there?
Well, cyclically adjusted, the labour force participation rate had been falling into this. So the big jump in labour force participation rate for the 1990s, for example, was driven by increased female participation in the labour force. If anything, what's happened is that's starting to unwind now as people realise the importance of taking care of their families. The question going forward is if the hybrid model becomes more acceptable, is female participation in the labour force again going to rise? Or will people think that multitasking from home is just more stressful than multitasking from a remote office when you've got a family? I think that's $1 billion question. I agree with you in terms, the other thing which may argue in favour of increased labour force participation is if you are in your 60s, for example, and you don't have to have a long commute to the office every day, but you can do your job at home, does that tempt you to stay longer in the labour force, working from home, enjoying the best of both worlds? So I think the jury is still very much out on that. But if I was to have to guess, I would sort of say labour force participation, if anything, is going to rise rather than going to fall under this new framework.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense to me, because there's a chunk of the labor force that, the not very skilled laborers that have not been working because they've been getting money from the government. And at some point, from the data, that point should be around now, their choice is either to work or to massively cut back on their spending, things that really hurt. So I think in that environment, then you'll go back into the labor force. So just to kind of to wrap things up, it's just a fascinating, multi-dimensional conversation. I think I could probably go on for another day or two. But what would you say are the 3 main takeaways from our chat today?
The importance of an anchor, the importance of a sense of purpose and a sense of values, and being, as an individual, being able to check in regularly with those values and ensure that the 4 domains of your life, work, family stroke social, personal development and leisure, are meeting those values. So I'd say that's definitely the first thing. The second one is that we've moved to a situation where there are multiple stakeholders, and you need to acknowledge those multiple stakeholders and understanding how the system operates and being able to survive within a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world, is going to be key to survival going forward. And thirdly, that don't just use the model of the pandemic to determine your investment behavior. It was good friendly, i.e. value friendly in the equity market context, and service hostile. I think going forward, where you can associate and you can still get services, the new model is still going to be service friendly and good hostile. And this is a disinflationary environment rather than an inflationary environment. And therefore, I think the rise in commodity prices is a false dawn. And that going forward, that's still got a lot to be unwind. I think lastly but not leastly, and I think the thing which overrides everything else is the importance of leadership. Leadership, be it at a geopolitical level, leadership at a domestic country level, leadership at an enterprise level. And it's no longer going to be sufficient for you as a leader. Every time there's sufficient demand, what do? You look at the bottom line rather than the top line, you cut costs, and you meet your earnings for that quarter. And then after 10 quarters, you completely lost your way to where you originally wanted to go. It's going to be more about focus on the top line. It's going to be more about the focus on leadership. It's going to be more on the focus about how you intrinsically motivate people in a rapidly changing environment and you meet their diverse needs. And above all else, I think what's most generous is, oh, they're young, they don't know what it is to have gone through tough times. Maybe they know something we don't know. Maybe their wants and their needs are different. And we have to keep an open mind to that. And at the end of the day, entrepreneurship and about good leadership and running a business is about having a strong sense of empathy, and that empathy about what people need. I think what people need now is a certain sense of security within all this uncertainty. What people need now is a sense that they can live a life which doesn't destroy the environment, a life which doesn't detract from other people's enjoyment and leave them in poverty. And I think people who walk in and look at that mission statement on the wall and don't even understand the difference between a mission statement and a purpose statement are misguided, that we should be less cynical about that and pay more attention to that. Maybe ESG in the short term has gone a little bit too far, but I don't think it's not going to be the trend of the future.
Amazing, and thank you so much, Ian. Our viewers will really appreciate your insights, and hopefully we can chat again soon.
My pleasure. Have a good one.